This is the images that you just saw, by the way, and the procedure. Same thing with the temples of Aphrodite and the eunuchs of Aphrodite that we talked about earlier too. Artemis, the same thing. And as I said, the Jewish sectarian people in this area that were opposed to the messiahship of Jesus and that he would be Lord and Savior were the ones who actually gave sort of approval by once again comparing circumcision to that ritual of self-castration by the priests. And if you're just tuning in on this video, it's probably rather shocking where we began this. But anyway, this is part of our discussion here. We're in front of the temple of Artemis of the Ephesians. What's left of it? There's nothing left of this building. When we finally get to Greece and we get to the Acropolis, you'll see that amazing ruin of the building, the Parthenon. Remember, when you see it, it's really big, it's very impressive, and the Parthenon is a quarter the size of what this was. 1/4. So when you see it, multiply that times 4, and that was the Temple of Artemis of the Ephesians. The rest of bits and pieces of the Temple of Artemis of the Ephesians in the British Museum. So you can see the base of one of the columns. It's carved out with human images, life size at the base of just one of these massive columns that they had, and all kinds of other bits and pieces that were part of the temple, because when the British came through here, they just plundered the place and they took it back to England. So that's where it is now. Artemis, you saw the images of Artemis, the animals, all the breasts, all the animals around her, just a sort of a grotesque figure that evolved from that one big blob that was from so long ago. But if you ever wanted to see one of these images, it's in a strange place. One of the finest statues, if you can call it such, because I find the image personally very grotesque, and I suppose we should, but one of the finest sculptures, life size of one of these, is in the Vatican Museum. So you can find it in their sculpture gallery there. And if you happen to be in Italy, go visit Tivoli. In the Tivoli Gardens, they actually have one that's been turned into a fountain. So these images are huge and they are around. You can catch them, but interestingly enough, they've been moved from here to places like Rome. Now, temples were very, very interesting structures when we look at them. Back then, this was common. They were places of sanctuary. You got near this temple within bow shot, as far as you can shoot an arrow. That's sort of a relative thing, but as far as you could shoot an arrow, if you had done something, been accused of something, stolen something, murdered someone, all you have to do is get within an arrow shot of this temple and you had sanctuary. In other words, you were home free. Can you imagine the type of people that hung out around this temple? I mean, they were fleeing something, and if they went outside of arrow shot or bow shot from the temple, they're going to get caught, they're going to get taken into custody, they're going to get killed, they're going to get imprisoned, they might be made a slave, whatever the case may be. So the temple, as you have heard before, was a bank because people would bring their money here, but it was also a sanctuary for some very, very unsavory people that would have to hang around here and had no other place to go. That was a temple. Now, if you're a priest in that temple, that means you work inside. Nobody is allowed to go inside except the priests in your typical temples anyway. And they would go through the sacrifices and the rituals, but one of the things that they had to do was they had to keep themselves pure, ritually pure all the time. Now, this is a pagan temple, but of course you're probably thinking this sounds like the temple in Jerusalem. You're absolutely correct. The temple in Jerusalem, even though the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, our God and Father, is nothing like any of these idols, because those gods were capricious and you didn't know if they were going to be around or they were going to kill you the next moment or something like that. But the temple in Jerusalem functioned very much the same way as these ancient temples did, rituals being different. The priests only were allowed on the inside. They had to be pure, keep themselves pure to the standard of the purity that the God demanded. And in our case, God gives us His commands in writing. Says, this is the way I want you to be pure. And boy, I'll tell you, the Bible goes into a great detail on keeping yourselves pure, because remember, bride of Christ, your purity is your betrothal veil, that veil that you wear for a year between the time you're betrothed and the time the bridegroom comes to get you. That's why being pure as a Christian isn't an option. It's something that says, I love my bridegroom. I can't wait to see my bridegroom. Just he's an amazing bridegroom. We wear that veil. The veil says, I'm keeping myself pure for her. Purity for a Christian is non-negotiable. That's why he says, keep yourself pure, and it should be a joy to keep myself pure for him. The priests would keep themselves pure for their gods. They would keep the temple really clean. They would sweep it out. They would scrub it because they didn't want the God mad at them in these pagan temples. Now, temple in Jerusalem, similar, different God, different attitude. I like this. But you know, what's interesting about a temple as well, in case you didn't notice, for instance, over at the other Artemis Temple over by Sardis and other temples that you will see the ruins of, including the ones in Greece and on the Parthenon, they didn't use any mortar between the stones. That's especially true of the temples in Jerusalem. They didn't use any mortar. And the temple in Jerusalem had one step further that these other temples I don't think did. And that was when you built the temples in Jerusalem, and there were actually, well, we say there was a first temple and a second temple, but there was kind of a third one in between where it was a revamp of the others. But you weren't allowed to chisel anything within earshot of the site of the temple. All the stones had to be measured and chiseled out off premises. So there was no sound of chiseling, and there was no chiseling as the temple was being constructed. It was constructed in peace. It was constructed in silence. It was constructed carefully and perfectly off premise where you didn't see the construction or hear the construction going on, and then it starts coming together. Now, here's kind of the devotional point in all of this, because this is first thing in the morning and we can do a devotional here. I think it's a really good place to do it. Over in Ephesians, I say that word. Do you know you're in Ephesus right now? You're in Ephesus right now. So in the book of Ephesians, to the Ephesians, the Apostle Paul writes these words. So then you are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God. Here it comes. Built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the cornerstone, in whom the whole structure being joined together grows into a holy temple in the Lord. In him you also are being built together into a dwelling place by the Spirit. Now, you know that we are called by Paul over in Corinthians, we are the temple of the Holy Spirit. We know that. That is an abstraction to us. To these people, the people in Corinth who saw the temple of Apollo, which you will see, to the people in Ephesus when Paul is talking about being built together into a holy temple, what's going into their minds? This and maybe many other temples, as you'll see the ruins of later on this morning. We are being built together into a holy temple. Peter brings this out over in 1 Peter chapter 2, where he's relating back to where Jesus says, Peter, you're the rock. What kind of rock? Well, a small rock. Well, don't ask what does it mean, ask what does it do? Upon this big rock, those of you who've been to Caesarea Philippi, you know about the giant rock there, and Jesus was pointing out to a different meaning in that, but upon this big rock I will do what? One word. Build my church. Peter's a building block. He knows this. Jesus said so. Over in 1 Peter 2, Peter says we are all being built together into a holy temple as living stones, with Jesus Christ being the chief cornerstone. He talks about him being the capstone, the cornerstone, the stone that God rejected. All of these things. We're rocks. We're being built into a temple. And the temples that they had in mind were like this. Especially when Paul writes to the Ephesians, when Peter sends his letters out, where does it go? It's not going to Jerusalem, it's going over here. They know these temples. These people knew temples. And God says, this is what I'm building you into. I'm going to live in the midst of you, and you're the stones. But here's my last point. No mortar between the stones. No chiseling happening on the premises, at least for the temple in Jerusalem. And that's so important. Because when God stacks us together, it's a very interesting phenomenon. As one man said, with a brick, when you're building something with a brick, any other brick will do when you're building a wall. But with a stone, the builder has to pick just the right stone to go next to the other stones. It's his selection. The builder in Jerusalem who made the temple, the chief architects that put this thing together, they had to make sure that all the chiseling was done off premises and then brought in and the stones packed together. You are the stones. Guess what? There's no mortar between you. That means you're right up against each other. That's what we are. We are right up against each other. And there are irregularities in the stones. And they're abrasive. And they rub us the wrong way. They rub us so that, man, it's an irritation. And you know what we do to fix that on each other? We get out the hammer and chisel and we start trying to knock off the irregularities off the stones beside us. Don't we? And God says, that's my job. Your job is to be part of my temple. Your job is to stay in place because I'm going to live in your midst. This is what God tells us. And that's how temples were built. We rub each other raw sometimes, but God knows why He set us next to each other. Frankly, I look at the people around me and I say, I love most of them. I'm not talking about you guys here, of course. I love all of you. But, you know, people in my life, I love most of them. But others, I need to try and fix. And God says, that's none of your business. Jesus prayed in His greatest prayer, really, John chapter 17, that I pray that those who come after me because of their message, that's you coming after the message of the apostles, that those that come after me might be one, Father, as He prayed, as you and I are one. As you are in me and I am in you, may we be in them. May they be one. You can read it yourself. It's several verses. But the interesting thing is that Jesus' prayer was that we would be one, like the stones in a temple that make up a temple without any rocks missing, with no holes in the walls. And God lives in the midst. And that oneness that He talks about, which is fascinating, He says, I pray that they may be one. There's one word missing. God deliberately left it out. I pray that they might be one. But that word isn't there. Except when that word isn't there. Unless that word isn't there. The oneness of us is absolute. And we tend to work against it when we're trying to chisel each other to make a better fit in the temple when God is the one who is building the temple. And then He says, I'm building it the way I want it to. And I'm going to keep the stones clean because He's the one who keeps the stones clean because Jesus is our great high priest. And He says, I'm going to dwell in your midst and we're going to be just soaked in the smoke of His glory as the sacrifices burned in the temple, so to speak, the glory of God fills the temple, so to speak. That's us. What are you going to do with that? I don't know. Chew on it for a while, though. And when you start being rubbed the wrong way by another person, just remember, when you think they're rubbing me the wrong way, do not get out the hammer and chisel. Realize God put them there for a reason. And love them right back. Don't chisel them down. Make sense? Well, welcome to the site of the Temple of Artemis of the Ephesians. Gigantic. This thing was absolutely vast. And I hate to say it, but you saw those horrible, weird images of Artemis of the Ephesians. And she's been sort of updated for us in the movie Wonder Woman. That's not exactly what you saw in the statues.
Quite an upgrade.
Quite an upgrade, yes, indeed.